Welcome everyone to today's Ecology Center seminar presented by Dr. Jonathan Hall, who's an ecologist, educator, writer, podcast producer, and wilderness enthusiast based in Morganton, West Virginia, and is currently the director of the Wilderness Geography Lab and assistant professor of geography at West Virginia University. And if you were here yesterday to join us on the seminar, you would have seen how Dr. Hall centers his research and teaching around critical wildlife geography and conservation, integrating disciplines of Black and Indigenous geographies, ecology, political ecology, and conservation to solve environmental problems. Dr. Hall graduated from Morehouse College with a bachelor's in biology and a focus in environmental studies and a PhD in ecology from the Ohio State University. So I welcome Dr. Hall and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beckman. And to all of you once again for sticking with the seminar series. I'm really excited to be able to talk about my research more specifically as it relates to California condors. So this research, or this talk is going to be maybe a little bit more familiar. And if you are uncomfortable with yesterday's discussions about, explicitly white supremacy and Black geographies, Indigenous geographies, awesome. I encourage you to, to sit with those points that we talked about, and I'll definitely be coming back to them at the end of the talk today. But this talk will be a little bit more familiar. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we can get started. All right, so this evening I'm going to be talking about California condor movement ecology. So this is going to be kind of a summation of the work that my lab, graduate students, and I have been conducting with California condor telemetry data since about 2014. Okay, so we're not going to go into too much detail in the weeds because there's a lot to cover with the research. We'll give kind of a broad strokes of things, but I'm happy to talk about kind of the details and the nitty-gritty of data analysis and all of that. So just to make sure that we're all oriented to the same sort of circumstances for California condors, Turtle Island, or otherwise known as North America's largest flying bird, wingspans up to 9 feet, really magnificent. I talked to a number of you who have said that you've been able to see them in Zion National Forest and maybe in other areas, and that's certainly a treat to see these birds up close. They are obligate scavengers. Their primary food sources are mammal fauna. Historically, the large macrofauna that it existed across North America. But then there are also populations on the coast that feed on marine mammals, and we'll talk a little bit more about those populations in a bit. They're a long-lived species. They reach sexual maturity at about 5 to 7 years old, so it takes a long time for them to get to reproductive age. And their lifespan is 60 years plus. The oldest known living condor is a condor by the name of Topa Topa, which he's a resident of the Los Angeles Zoo, and he was born in 1967. And so we're not exactly sure how long condors live, but they do live multiple decades. So this creates, of course, issues with biological amplification and their exposure to anthropogenic effects. And so the ways in which they're impacted negatively by human activity can have these really disproportionate effects on their population. And they reproduce once every 3 years. And so, when we lose condors, it's a big blow to the population. So it's really important. This work is really important for making sure that they stay on the landscape. And so the historical threats to condors, certainly megafauna decline that was post-Pleistocene, and the proliferation of human populations in this part of the world definitely had an impact on California condors. I mean, the macrofauna or the megafauna species that are no longer here, that are extinct. Marsupial lions, sloth bears, those sorts of organisms that would be prey items for California condors disappeared. Um, but as we mentioned yesterday, there is kind of a very important inflection point in the way in which the environment was impacted by human activity. And thinking about European colonization and the impacts that indigenous human beings, were having on the environment, with species extinction, was happening at a much slower rate than when Europeans showed up and decided to change the ecological regimes of the environments that they were controlling. So we had this broad and rapid landscape transformation that precipitated the decline of the California condor. And so we can think about megafauna decline, right? And this unprecedented speed of extinction of the buffalo from the landscape. And this is a photo of buffalo skulls. That were from buffalo hunts, right? And not only for an economic base for European settlers and a food base for European settlers, but also as a means of eliminating indigenous people who were resisting the spread of settler colonialism on their lands. So we see this dramatic increase, right? And then we have the removal of indigenous humans from different environments. This is a famous painting of the Trail of Tears following the Indian Removal Act. And again, we're talking about these white supremacist policies that resulted in these broad scale changes. And when we think about the ways in which human populations historically interacted with other non-human species, and the removal of those individual or those cultures from those areas, we're talking about removing a keystone culture, a keystone actor in the ecology. So this other effect of European colonization. And then what replaces those ecological regimes and those relationships is something that looks very different and has really negative effects. So human beings before European colonization were certainly causing changes to the environment, but nothing on the scale of, this is a photo of the Cuyahoga River that caught fire in the mid 20th century, and one of the events that led to the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Water Act, right? And so all of these sort of photos, and this is to drive home the idea that the onset of settler colonialism, which is driven by white supremacist landscape policies and removal policies and agricultural policies, are very different than what humans had been doing and interacting with the environment. And they had negative impacts on condors as well as many species that went extinct. So now, in the present day, we have isolated populations of California condors that used to be much more widespread across the landscape. There are 4 populations in the United States, 3 in California, 1 in Grand Canyon region, which is in the southwestern portion of Utah and northwestern portion of Arizona in the Grand Canyon region. And then there's a smaller population of condors in Baja California. So when we think about condors and how they're being impacted, there are some contemporary threats to populations. And again, they stem from the settler colonial state, how human beings in this dominant culture are interacting with the environment. Plastic production is a big issue, not only for condors, but just for general environmental contamination. The way that it impacts condors is that condors will pick up pieces of plastic, and we think they mistake it for bone, which are important nutrients to feed their chicks. And so, chicks will die from crop rot. And it's because these pieces of plastic that are not digestible get stuck in their crop and they die. Adult condors tend not to suffer from this. Chemical contamination, this is a picture that I took from the field site, and a dangerous poisonous gas may be present. And this habitat where Hopper Mountain Wildlife Refuge sits right in the middle of a large fracking operation in Southern California, right? So we have a broad scale chemical contamination. Talked yesterday about the chemical contamination that makes it into the marine environment that has impacts on negative impacts on condors that are feeding on marine mammals. New fire regimes on the landscape, the scale and the frequency of fires that are happening now, that are literally happening right now in California and across the West, are different than what condors are experiencing. Electrical infrastructure. There's been a number of mortalities from birds flying into power lines and landing on power lines. So that's another issue. And then, of course, lead ammunition is one of the primary threats to California condors. And again, all these photos are from the field, so you can go and see, these impacts on these birds. So in thinking about lead ammunition and how it impacts condors, they mainly ingest lead through the consumption of spent ammunition fragments. And so the above photo is of a lead bullet on the left versus a non-lead ammunition, a copper bullet on the right. And you can see the difference once a lead bullet impacts the target, it fragments. And below in this picture is a X-ray photo of lead fragments within an animal. This is the neck of a deer that was X-rayed, and you can see the effects of the impact of a lead bullet. And so you're out hunting, you shoot an animal with a lead bullet, you most likely leave the entry wound area and a portion around it because it has lead in it, and that's the portion that's left for condors, and they gobble that carrion down and ingest these lead fragments. So lead is, it's widely used because it's cheap to manufacture, it's heavy, it fragments on impact, which is great, for hunting. It is a lethal instrument. So condors ingest the lead from game animals, but also from pest animals. And again, I put pest in quotation marks to mark the different ways in which different cultures and societies sort of label organisms, right? So, a pest animal might be prairie dogs or feral pigs because of the impact that they have on settler colonial ways of being in the environment. Whereas, well, of course, pigs were not present here before European colonization, but certainly other animals that are deemed pests. That's a direct result of this new ecology, these new invasive ecological regimes that are present. But certainly, depredation of pest species or species that are termed problem species are also make up the condor diet. And if you're shooting them with lead bullets, then the condors are ingesting them. So for the purposes of our work, we're mostly focusing on the Southern California population in Bitter Creek. There's a little bit of overlap between the Central California populations in terms of the birds that are tagged with these telemetry units. So some of the data that I'm going to talk about includes those Central California populations, but the overwhelming majority of it includes the Southern California flock. Would love to work with the populations in Utah and Arizona. So this is a great opportunity to speak with people and think about collaborations. And also in Baja California, it's a very different sort of socio-ecological landscape in that part of the world. And so, always looking to do more work with condors. So the research questions for the results I'm going to share are as follows. So, the first study in looking at the spatial-temporal patterns of condor foraging activity. And so, the work in my lab is really focusing on the patterns in which the patterns of condor movement when they're on the ground. So these times when these condors are going to be encountering lead and other contaminants in their environment and understanding that. The second question, looking at lead ammunition policy in California and whether or not the statewide ban or whether or not lead ammunition policy had an impact on condor lead exposure. As I mentioned, there's now currently a statewide ban, but prior to that, there were different territories within California, within the condor's range, where hunting with lead ammunition was prohibited prior to the statewide ban. And so we can look at that, since we have these differential land management practices, we can look at how condors foraging in areas that don't have a lead ban policy versus areas where they do, and see whether or not that has an impact on their lead exposure. The third question is looking at movement patterns as it relates to fire in Los Padres National Forest, and how their condors are responding to fire that's on the landscape. And the last question is, kind of foundational life history information about condors, and looking at the demographics and seasonal characteristics of daily travel distances. And this is important because, condors, we have technology that can look at, can get really fine scale information on how these condors are moving across the landscape. And we can ask these questions, these very basic questions about, how they move and how they exist on the landscape, that we weren't able to answer before. And so this is a really interesting question. It has implications for management that I'll talk about in a little bit. So the first question, and generally the methods that we're using, the results from this work all come from the same data set. It's increased as we've collected more and more data over the years, but it's all coming from this telemetry data. And so condors within all the populations, including ones in Baja California, are tagged with these GSM GPS telemetry units and solar powered units. You can see it here in this photo just above the wing tag. And this tagging of these particular units began in 2013. Condors had been tagged with radio telemetry units, which give a very coarse location data. And then after that, satellite telemetry, which collects data at much fewer or much longer time intervals. So about 90% of the birds in California are tagged with these telemetry units. And so we're able to get a tremendous amount of data. The information that we're interested in from these units are the location, where these birds are in time, their altitude and their horizontal speed, which allows us, both the altitude and the horizontal speed allows us to distinguish whether or not the bird is flying, and whether or not the bird is close to the ground or far above the ground. And so we can infer, whether or not a condor is roosting, whether or not a condor is engaged in soaring flight, or moving across the landscape at a rapid speed. And so the intervals that these telemetry units will collect this location, altitude, and horizontal speed data varies, but we can get data every second versus every as frequently as every second, and up to every 2 hours. So we're able to get a lot of information from an individual bird over a period of time, that allows us to ask and answer a lot of these questions. The data that we analyze for these studies is looking at the 15-minute interval. And that's the data that we're able to collect most consistently. As you can imagine, collecting data every 1 second on location fills up the space on a small unit like that on the wing, to the point where the unit is not able to collect the data and dump it into the cell phone network. And that's how this data is transmitted. So really, really neat technology. I was hoping at this stage in our work to be able to talk more about accelerometer data. And the reason why accelerometer data is really neat is because it allows us to remotely identify specific behaviors. And I mentioned earlier that from location, altitude, and horizontal speed, we have to infer the behaviors of the condors. But with accelerometer data, we're able to really distinguish behaviors that we might not be able to tease out as easily just by location, altitude, and horizontal speed. So, if we were interested in a bird that has a horizontal speed of, less than 3 knots per hour, it's very difficult to distinguish just on the GPS data whether or not the bird is perching versus whether or not it's walking, right? And so the accelerometer data allows us to distinguish those behaviors. And then like soaring flight versus flapping flight might be another behavior that we're able to distinguish based on accelerometer information. As you might imagine, managing that technology is a big challenge, and certainly outside of my expertise. And so the company that develops these units, Cellular Tracking Technologies, um, is at the cutting edge of developing this, but there are certainly constraints to that, and so that work is ongoing. And so looking at the spatial temporal foraging patterns of birds, answering this first research question, um, that data set, we analyzed about 450,000 data points from 28 condors that had been tagged from 2013 to 2015. And so from that large data set, we pared it down to about 1,800 points that we feel confident that those identified as those points where birds were on the ground and potentially foraging. So spaces are points where they were away from their nests, away from known roosting sites, in areas where they were still and close to the ground, and so likely foraging points. And so from those 1,800 points, we're able to look at some of the patterns of their activity across the landscape. And one of the things that we were interested in looking at is where's the bulk of the activity of ground foraging. And about 75% of it occurs between the hours of about 11 a.m. to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And as I mentioned last time, and this is a histogram of those data, this makes sense because thermal maximums in the atmosphere are around the same time during the day. And so it makes sense that a bird that relies on orographic lift and thermal lift would be feeding and on the ground during this time. But again, this is something that we just didn't know about these birds before. The median time is right around noon, lunchtime, quite literally. So we also observed month-to-month variation in their foraging activity. And so we saw a high of their foraging activity, so the maximum amount of foraging activity between the months of August and September. And again, we're at a seasonal time where thermal maximums or thermals are at their highest, and we see a low during the winter months, right? So really important information, things that was inferred in the literature, but we didn't have evidence to support that, or as strong evidence to support that. And then looking at the land cover types that these condors were foraging in, our analysis showed that there were 7 land cover types that were significantly positively associated with ground foraging sites, and 8 land cover types that were negatively associated with condor foraging. And this is also really important because it allows us to be more targeted in our land management practices. If we're focusing on more specific land cover types, we can, and with the telemetry data, the location data, we can really home in on where these birds are feeding, and make sure that those areas are free of lead, that there are resources for those birds to get onto the ground and feed, and then come off of the ground. And then we can also look at land cover variation, ground foraging activity by land cover across the season or across the months. And the 3 bars here represent 3 of the 7 land cover types that are positively associated with ground foraging. And we can see the variation even within those land cover types across season. So again, we're getting a higher resolution of the ways in which these birds are behaving and how they're using the landscape, that in the winter months, resources might be better used to managing dry chaparral and coastal grasslands, whereas in the summer months and later on in the year, the focus might shift to more coastal grasslands in terms of land management. So the scale at which we're able to, the specificity at which we're able to manage these birds is really helpful. All right, so moving on to our second question, does lead ammunition policy before the statewide ban, sort of in these discrete areas, have an impact on condor lead exposure? And this was work that was conducted by a master's student, Evan McGreeth, who's in my lab and now works for the Ventana Wildlife Society and helps with managing condors. And so that data set was looking at about 208,000 GPS points from 37 condors. And from those points and from those birds, we found about 9,000 ground foraging points. And because we wanted to couple to couple ground foraging activity to lead exposure and the time in which those birds were their blood lead concentration was being measured, we focused on 55 discrete exposure windows that occurred 1 month prior to a blood sample being taken, right? And the reason why we wanted to have that close temporal relationship is because of the way that lead is metabolized in the body and in a condor's body, and so we wanted to capture lead exposure for that period of time. So looking at where the bird has been prior to potential lead exposures. And so, once we had those blood lead concentrations and we knew where the birds were, then we analyzed, what are the relationships between that blood lead concentration and age, sex of the bird, environmental characteristics like land cover, but also whether or not that foraging activity occurred on lands that had an explicit ban on lead ammunition or lands where where lead ammunition was permitted. And so the results of that, first, the range of blood lead concentration within condors range widely from 0 micrograms per deciliter to 540 micrograms per deciliter. And it's really amazing how much lead these birds can have in their body. I mean, an equivalent 540 micrograms per deciliter in a human would be extremely detrimental, if not fatal. So it's amazing. And that bird actually lived with that blood lead concentration. And so, these birds are definitely exposed to lead on the landscape. The median value was about 22 micrograms per deciliter, which is just below the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recommendations for like lead toxicosis, when they would typically bring a bird in and get lead chelation treatment for lead exposure. So these birds are dealing with a fair amount of lead exposure on a regular basis. What we found from this data, from these 9,000 foraging points and these 55 exposure windows, were that the majority of condor foraging activity happened on landscapes where there was no explicit ban on lead ammunition. So we're talking mostly private land. During the study period, the only areas where you could hunt in California with lead ammunition is on private land. And 43% of the remaining activity mostly occurred on federally managed land or non-governmental land that had an explicit ban on lead policy. And so this is a picture of the corporate headquarters of Tejon Ranch. Tejon Ranch is about 50 miles, I think, north of Los Angeles. And it's this large collection of ranch land that's privately owned. But Tejon Ranch has had a ban on the use of lead ammunition for hunting purposes since 2007, right? And so these lands where there's a fair amount of foraging activity is not included in that 57% of foraging that happens on private land without a lead ban. And so the associations of blood lead concentration to the factors that we were looking at, we found that the only significant associations were with federal land where there was a ban on lead ammunition, and private land where there was no ban on lead ammunition. And we saw the relationship that where condors that fed more frequently in areas that had a federal land that had a lead ban, we saw significantly lower blood lead concentrations as compared to when condors were feeding on private land without a lead ban. All right, so the third question, looking at condor movement patterns that are impacted by fire in Los Padres. As I mentioned, this work is ongoing. We plan to use accelerometer data to really get this fine scale information on what the birds are doing in this habitat, instead of inferring whether or not they were foraging or not. We feel really confident that those points that I talked about before were ground foraging points, but it would be really nice to confirm that with accelerometer data. But of course, we ran into technical difficulties in doing that, in developing the accelerometers and then deploying them, and the units having enough power to both collect the location data, but also the accelerometer data. And so those technical difficulties have been overcome, and we're currently collecting data on those birds, and it's really cool data. So that's ongoing work, and this is another master's thesis project by Darren Gross, who's finishing up this work, and is also employed at the Ventana Wildlife Society, and doing condor work, and also non-lead outreach. So what we were able to do with the data that we had was looking at their foraging and roosting patterns in relationship to whether or not fire had occurred in those areas where they were. And this map shows an outline in black of the Los Padres National Forest, nesting sites in the hexagon, the brown hexagons, and then foraging and roosting points in the different shapes. And so what you want to take away from this is that most of the activity that we see is red diamonds and orange stars, both in the Southern California population and then in the coastal Central California population. And so condors are avoiding both ground foraging and roosting during these large conflagrations, which is not really surprising, right? Nobody wants to be in a giant fire. But what we see is that the majority of activity, both roosting and foraging, occurs on lands that have experienced fire in the last decade. Right, so those points that are in blue and green are those areas that are occurring on non-fired habitat that hasn't experienced fire in the last decade. And so we're still kind of teasing out and trying to understand this pattern and what might be driving this pattern. But we have these discrete activity areas within Los Padres National Forest. You can see that in the sort of northwestern part of the forest, there's really not a lot of condor activity there, and a lot of condor activity around nesting habitat. So that work is ongoing, and hope to share more from the results of that research, and also to analyze some accelerometer data, because I'm really excited about that. So the last question, in looking at life histories of condors and just their general movement ecology, their daily travel distance, this is work that was done by myself and a colleague, Insu Hong. And so we're looking at a larger data set, the daily travel distances of condors. So we're talking about almost 4 million data points from 85 condors over the course of 5 years. So a big data set. So big shout out to Dr. Hong for being the spatial analyst expert in this and working through this data. And so, we worked through nearly 500,000 hours of condor travel, 30,000 daily trips, daily trajectories across the landscape. And this map is showing just a collection of all the different paths and trips that condors are taking in a day. And so our findings were really interesting. Most of the daily travel that a condor is doing is under 100 kilometers, so they're not traveling particularly far, although there are trips that extend for several hundred kilometers. The longest trip that we observed in a single day was 477 kilometers, and so far that's the longest trip that's ever been measured in a single day by a condor, as far as I know. And that same bird, during that same one day, nearly 500-kilometer trip, in the 2 subsequent days, traveled a total of almost 1,300 kilometers, which is almost the length of California north to south. And so, this is really exciting for us to understand how far these birds are capable of traveling in a really short distance. There's been a previous study in the Zion National Forest population of condors out where you all are, about travel distances of condors over a period of a week or so. So it's really exciting to just see what these animals are capable of in terms of moving across the landscape. We also observe that older birds and nesting birds tend to travel longer in a given day. And that makes sense given the fact that older birds are more experienced, they're stronger and more confident in the landscape, and that nesting birds would travel longer during a day because they are, um, you know, feeding and feeding chicks and needing to spend more time out foraging for food. What's interesting about this is that there was a previous study looking at home range of the bird, so the area in which a bird is traveling in a given day, and those findings didn't weren't able to determine any differences between nesting birds versus non-nesting birds in terms of the size of their home range. Um, so you know, it highlights the importance of looking at the ways in which these birds are moving across the landscape from multiple perspectives, because we're able to tease out information when we analyze data in multiple different ways um, that we otherwise wouldn't know. Um, and so, as you might expect, the daily travel distances tended to be longer, were significantly longer during the summer months versus the winter months. And of course, that has to do with the flight conditions, the atmospheric flight conditions for these birds moving across the landscape. Um, and so, to wrap kind of all of this in a bow, in this body of work that's happened over the last half decade, you know, it's just really exciting to see the finer scale resolution of condor movement ecology and being able to answer these questions that are really important for management purposes and understanding these animals that we simply weren't able to have this clear evidence to support. So, you know, knowing when these birds, what time of day they're most active, the land cover types they're frequenting, what time of year they're most active, the distances that they're able to travel, and the distances that they tend to travel, being able to determine, you know, what are the boundaries of a condor once they settle into a territory, and where are they likely to go, or where are they capable of going. And then looking at, you know, human impacts, right? Because this is this question of how are these birds going to persist on the landscape in the future. Um, and so fire, you know, from this work, you know, we're speculating that fire may have been a necessary facilitator of habitat access for these birds, clearing away underbrush so that condors can get onto the ground and get off of the ground when they're feeding. But certainly this new fire regime, and again, I'm driving this point home of that this new fire regime comes out of a particular mindset, a particular culture of management, of land management, that's rooted in settler colonialism, which is rooted in white supremacy. Um, is not good for condors. I mean, in the same way that it's not good for human beings. Um, so this is something that we have to interrogate. And then, of course, the issue of lead ammunition, you know, lead being present on the landscape in ways that it hadn't been before. You know, the industrial production of firearms, the industrial production um, of the hunting industry, which, you know, is a complex thing. I've talked with many of you who are hunters and grew up hunting, and hunting is a really important part of your lives. It's something that I enjoy and something that I want to increasingly be a part of my life, right? But these are things that we have to, you know, these are life ways that we have to confront and deal with when we're thinking about um, uh, what uh, what the impacts of the ways in which we're living are. So, you know, the ban has had a positive impact. I'm not sure uh, whether that bullet point really makes much sense. Um, but lead bans have had a positive impact on condors, and we'll see whether or not that policy continues to take effect in other areas. But again, we're talking about a very charged political sort of argument that's being made and being argued about. Yep, the elephant's back. And again, you know, driving this point home of like, we have to talk about these issues because it helps us understand um, the way forward, right? And so when we're thinking about Condor Futures in a settler colonial landscape, right, in an anthropogenic landscape, settler colonial activity is having a negative impact on condors, as it's having a negative impact on many species. And so mitigating these measures are important, and can have a positive impact. Things like the ban on lead ammunition, um, the things like the ban on DDT and these other chemicals that are used. But is that sufficient? Is it sufficient in that, there's a ban on lead in California, but there's still a fight on that in other states, and meanwhile condors are suffering. And certainly our industrial chemical production and that feeds into our lifeways is something that is continuing to have a negative impact. So are the policies, the sort of acute policies that help lessen the impacts, are they enough? Are they sufficient? And then, of course, this question of who gets to decide what happens to the landscape. In all of these decisions, it's important to recognize that power over who makes decisions over these lands was taken from one group of people, or sort of collectively, but from multiple groups of people, and put into the hands of others, right? And so, who makes a decision on policy that happens in California is the state of California. But the state of California exists, and the state of, or any state, Utah, West Virginia, any state, exists on top of an indigenous landscape that was suppressed in order to make way for the state. So, there's been a really interesting conversation about condors and indigenous communities. And this back and forth that occurred in High Country News a number of years ago between Sandy Wilbur, who's an OG condor biologist, and a member of the Nez Perce tribe, about this idea of condor reintroduction to Hell's Canyon, an historical area of the Nez Perce people. Sandy was making the case that, it doesn't really make much sense to reintroduce condors to this area. And one of the arguments that he made was there are no records of condors even existing in this area. But his reference point was European settlers who were moving through the area in the mid-19th century, right? So we begin to see again the reference points and whose knowledge matters, what history matters, in making these decisions. And of course, the Nez Perce have to, and any indigenous community has to come to the settler colonial state of the United States of America to get condors, an animal that used to exist on their lands and they used to have a relationship with. If they want to have it again, then they have to come to the settler colonial state, and the settler colonial state dictates what happens. Okay, and so like the condor restoration and any conservation of a species in North America or any place that has a colonial history happens within this socio-political landscape that we have to deal with and we have to talk about if we're going to do this work well, I would argue. And so thinking about Condor Futures, again, who owns the condors, right? This is a question that I posed to an organizer at the Condor meeting. And their response was, he thought about it for a second and said, well, we do. And, there we are again, like, who is the we that we're talking about? And are we being explicit about the we? Because the we in this case means the settler colonial state. And so when we talk about communities that are fighting for their land sovereignty, that are fighting to have their lifeways restored, that's not the we that we're talking about. We're talking about the settler colonial state. So we need to be explicit about that. And it makes sense that we would not be explicit about that if we're uncomfortable having these conversations about this history. But we need to. So who has jurisdiction over these birds? Who's responsible for a sick condor that ingested lead in Utah or in Arizona and then comes back to California? Does Utah Department of Natural Resources have to fit the bill? Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have to do that? There's no federal ban on lead ammunition, and it's funny to think about what that would take politically. And so, these are these questions, and how is management coordinated across these settler imposed boundaries? Again, this idea of jurisdiction and who has control and who makes the decisions are really important. And so in thinking about Condor Futures within the context of conservation geography, as I discussed in the last talk, this conservation geography, the thing that I'm pushing for is this anti-racist and pro-indigenous sovereignty, indigenous self-determination, ecological theory and praxis, right? And so the idea of keeping restoration of keystone cultures, not just keystone species, not just species that the settler colonial state wants to see, but the cultures that were extirpated from the landscape, restoring those, that has to be part of this conversation. And then confronting the necessities of modernity, right? Like the things that we deem essential, that have been made essential by our lifeways, we have to be critical about those things. So do we need lead for hunting? Right? If it's costing the lives of condors, these are questions that we have to ask. Do we need industrial chemicals? If it's going to have these negative impacts, do we need plastics? Given the fact that it's having an impact, given the fact that there's a large mass of plastic in the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas, like, do we need these things given the impact? Do we need industrial agriculture? Right? Uh, are these things necessary? Do we need internal combustion engines? Do we need private property? All of these things that are products of the settler colonial state that exist on the landscape that are having a negative impact on non-human species and human communities, that are standing in the way of us preserving these species in a way that they used to exist on the landscape. And I'm not saying that the answers to these questions are no or yes, but what I want to push in this this idea of conservation geography is that we need to, in our work, explicitly answer questions like these, because this is the thing that we oftentimes ignore and we just sort of accept, like, yes, we need lead for hunting, or yes, we need industrial chemicals. We can't imagine a world without that. Yes, we need industrial agriculture. How are people going to eat without industrial agriculture? Yes, we need plastics, right? But, like, do we really need these things? And are they really important given the costs that they're having on our work and our communities, both human and non-human? So, I've been thinking about this question in conservation, and it occurred to me, like, are we actually saving species, or are we helping them coexist with lifeways that we're unwilling to change? And by we, I mean the settler colonial state, right? Is conservation work trying to figure out a way to save the world and to have these sustainable communities, or are we moving through this kind of iterations of settler colonial civilization light, right? For going from like Coca-Cola to Diet Coke to Coke Zero. Are we going from, condors being nearly extinct to them being back on the landscape, or a successful captive breeding program, and then them being reintroduced, but at a much less, much lower population in the future? Like, can we get back to a point where these communities are self-sustaining without, these large human inputs? And so that's a question that I want to leave you all with. Last thing is that it's really funny. If you all listen to the podcast Ologies, I posted this picture on Instagram and Twitter earlier this year, and it got picked up, and eventually the host of Ologies, Ali Ward, contacted me. And anyway, so we talked, and if you want to hear more about the Condor work, then you can listen to the Ologies podcast, because I'm on it, and that would be really awesome if you could share that with people. And that episode dropped like after the talk last night. So take a listen to that. And I'll end there with this picture from the video that you all saw yesterday. And I think it's amazing. A big shout out to Raymond Thompson Jr., who is an amazing media specialist, photojournalist, who I really like this photo because it juxtaposes, the questions that I want to think about and I want us to talk about sort of moving forward. The picture of the condors, and then the impact of the settler colonial state on the landscape. So thank you all for your attention. And this has been a really great experience meeting all of you. I really wish that we could have met in person, But thank you all for your time and your attention. It's been really great to get to know all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And if you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. And you can also pose questions in the chat, and let's give Dr. Hall a round of virtual